Hello, everyone. I think maybe if I could confirm if I'm audible.
You are?
Okay, thank you for that. Yes, so we welcome, I think, all our guests who are present, watching, and our YouTube live stream. And now we'll also, I think, introduce the panelists who are all present and with us. So I think, yes, sorry. Before we begin, maybe we can just introduce the different panelists. So we have Dr. Ekator from the University of Derby. Please just say hi and greet the
Hello.
audience. Yes.
Afternoon, everybody. My name
Thank
is
you for that.
Dr. Osato.
Thank you for that. We have Eli Kenny, who's also here with us.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you. And finally, we have Ugratna, who's also just joined us. I'm sorry, Ugratna, are you speaking? Because we can't really hear you.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me now? Is that okay?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yes. We can hear you now. Thank you for that. So I think before we begin, so just to introduce the session that we're having. So welcome to the African Plugged Live series. And the topic today is the importance of third world approaches to climate change. And I think this conversation is very necessary, especially given the fact that COP27 is happening in Egypt, which is in Africa, in at the end of this year, and I think also incorporating a lot of youth voices, and that's why we've chosen to use this platform specifically so we can be able to reach youth mainly on like social media and a lot of platforms that they generally tend to use. So before we begin, I think first I'll begin by reading and introducing the guests that we have today, and I think just to say thank you for joining us, and we look a lot of conversations that we're going to have. So first we have Dr. Egeso Ekator, sorry if I'm not pronouncing this properly. So Dr. Ekator joined the University of Derby Law School as a senior lecturer in law in September 2019 from the University of Chester, where he had taught on numerous undergraduate and postgraduate models. His main research areas include international environmental law, African international legal history, and natural resources governance. He has also published extensively on his research areas in reputable academic journals in the UK and all over the world. His academic papers have been cited by a plethora of organizations and international agencies, including the United Nations Refugee Agency and the Swiss Refugee Council. Dr. Ekator holds an LLB in law from the University of Benin and an LLM and PhD in law from the University of Hull, United Kingdom. Dr. Ekator has also been called to the Nigerian bar as a barrister and solicitor of the Supreme Court of Nigeria. So welcome, Dr. Ekator. We're
Thank you
very
very
glad
much.
to have you. And I think
Thanks.
also maybe just to note, so Dr. Ekoto is also my mentor in an academic forum known as the Afronomics Academic Forum East Africa. And he's been an amazing, I think, teacher and mentor in that space.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So our second panelist and guest today is Eli Kenny. And maybe just to introduce Eli. Eli is the managing director of HBCU Green Fund, which is an organization curating green infrastructure and renewable energy projects at historically Black colleges and universities and expanding the access to sustainability in the Black community. Eli's passion area in her work is to develop pipelines for educational and employment resources in the green economy for HBCU students and the Black community at large. Ela has served as a Green Ambassador with the Toyota Green Initiative and Green for All, where she advocated for an intersectional approach to building a sustainable world. For 8 years, Eli served in Howard University's Office of Sustainability as a program manager, where Eli has built a more sustainable campus with projects and educational efforts. Ayla is an internationally recognized environmental and social justice activist. At age 9, she gave her first public speech at the Million Youth Movement rally. At age 12, she co-founded the Georgia Kids Against Pollution. In 2003, at age 14, she received the prestigious Bowser Award. Her inspiring speech attracted global media attention for challenging Coca-Cola over water practices in India. She has served as the US delegate to the United Nations World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg, South Africa, where she spoke about poverty. She's motivated by her strong belief in combining the joy of entertainment with the responsibility and sacrifice of building a better world step by step. So that's Eli Kenny. And finally, I think, but not least, we have Ugratna. So Ugratna is a 26-year-old from a middle-class family in India, and Ugratna has several years of advocacy and policy experience on environment and development nexus. As a vocal advocate of meaningful youthful engagement, she has held elected leadership roles in multiple youth networks. Currently, she serves as the elected focal point of the Children and Youth Major Group of UNEP, an environment policy officer for the Major Group for Children and Youth, as part of which she's leading preparations for youth to UNEA and Stockholm International Meeting in 2022. By profession, she's a student and works part-time for ecological organization Plant for the Planet International. In the run-up to the Paris Agreement work program, she served in the negotiating team as one of the youngest diplomats, where she supported work of G77, AOSIS nations. She has processes for establishment of several youth engagement mechanisms in the UN system, such as UNCCD, Youth Caucus, STG7 Youth Constituency, Chemicals and Waste Youth Platform, and very recently the Youth Task Force for the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. In 2020, she was also nominated by the UN Secretary General as one of the 60 people globally to serve in the Multi-Stakeholder Champions Network of the UN Food Systems Summit. So I think that was very comprehensive, but welcome also Ugratna, and we're glad to have you all present. So I think just to begin and to introduce the topic, right? I'll begin with, I think, my first question going to Dr. Egesa, and this is generally just in terms maybe throughout, and this is maybe just in line of the work that your research generally tends to do, but the question in itself is that what do you think is the context of developing states, especially post-colonial developing states, and their interaction with climate change policy and law in the global context?
Thank you very, very much. That's a very good question. In terms of international climate governance, in terms of climate change, the first thing we need to remember is that the most vulnerable people tend to bear the worst impact of climate change. And the majority of the fossil fuels and polluting industries are actually Western companies, or mainly Western companies. So the idea is that in terms of international climate governance regime, there has to be more to be done. And a lot of people have said that initially the African states or the developing states did not play a major role. There's been issues around in terms of the payment scale, in terms of the ecological damage. Should the Western countries pay more for the damage and they've done to the environment that has impacted negatively on the climate? And the other question is, you also have, after the impact and influence and the continued impact of colonialism on many African states who are still, I'll just make a very good example of Nigeria for the Nigerian state, for example, which I'm very familiar with. In Niger Delta, which is the oil producing area in Nigeria, where you have where the oil and gas industry is actually based in Nigeria, for more than 60 years, you've got multinational corporations actually exploiting exploration of oil resources. And in terms of the damage they've done to the environment, a lot of people have said that the multinational corporations, the Nigerian government, have not actually paid enough compensation to the people living in that area. They've not restored the environment, they've not remediated the environment. So the people living in that Niger Delta area, for example, tend to bear the brunt of environmental injustices. The same people now are bearing the brunt of the negative impact of climate change. And the same people now do not have the resources to adapt to the negative impact of climate change. So, in a way, African states, developing countries need to play a more concerted role in trying to get climate justice and trying to ensure that the most vulnerable people, of society should not keep continuing to bear the negative impact of climate change. So, back to your question, in terms of from a post-colonial perspective, yes, we could see the impact of colonialism on the way African states have tried to negotiate, have tried to be part of this global climate governance regime. But some people have also said that in terms of the Paris Agreement is a very sort of like it's an upgrade of the previous manifestations of the treaties you have regarding climate change. But the question is, the multinational corporations need to be held accountable for their pledges. The multinational corporations need to be held accountable in terms of their promising net zero emissions. They are promising going green. Multinational corporations need to be held accountable for those promises, and also African states, developing countries need to play a major role in this same process. And also, even though the majority of the damage to the environment is from companies, Western companies, but now you also have developing countries, companies from Africans that are actually contributing to climate change now. So as a society, as developing countries need to play a more active hands-on role in being not just participants in the global climate change regime, but proper actors, relevant stakeholders, and try as much as possible to ensure that this climate framework, this international global climate framework, comes down to the locals, comes down to the ordinary person on the ground. Otherwise, it just remains something which is beyond the aspirations of the ordinary person. Thank you.
Thank you for that response. I think just to pick up on a few issues that I think have been noted, the fact that a lot of the frameworks in themselves are not necessarily recognized or even known by the people who they're most likely to affect. So I think we can pick up on that question later on. I think you're correct now, given the fact that you're dealing with a lot of policy. But I think even on the question of climate justice and how far maybe climate justice is incorporated within the global framework of climate change law. And maybe just to follow up with this question, you Gratna, given the fact that I think you've interacted specifically with policies, with aspects such as, sorry, one second. Yeah, sorry. Given the fact that you've interacted, for example, with policy at a global level specifically, how do you think climate justice is an issue that's being incorporated within a lot of the UN policy that's being developed on climate change?
Thank you so much for the great discussions, and also a big thank you for also inviting me here. It's such an honor, to be here in this panel alongside many esteemed guests that you have. To begin with how climate change is tackled in the UN system. I think what may be very helpful to highlight is that this year we celebrated 50-year anniversary of UNEP being born in Stockholm 1972 conference taking place, which was the first moment where actually UN came together to discuss environmental topic in the name of UNEP at 50 in Stockholm plus 50 that took place earlier this year, which means we have come very far, and there is a lot of work that still needs to happen. Of course, I'm not an African. I don't come from the continent. I've had the pleasure of visiting Africa a couple of times, mostly for work or conferences. But coming, from more like of a global South perspective, if we specifically, look at how young people or youth are being engaged, young people, especially from global South, they still continue to be more like an afterthought in a process, right? So now we have a particular negotiation, a particular treaty, particular something being developed. Let's bring young people from global South in a panel and try to, have them or engage them, and that is something that needs to be changed. You specifically, the UN itself tackles climate and environmental topics across different conventions. There's, of course, the 3 Rio conventions, climate, biodiversity, and desertification, which have their own COPs. And then you have the whole pillar on chemicals action, which also has its negotiations that take place that are happening, next year actually in a group called as ICCM 5, and there are many policy sort of deliberations that are taking place in that context. And then what we call as the multilateral environment agreements, or MEAs, is where some of these things, or what some of these things actually are uh, coming together. However, I mean, if you specifically see how much of the ownership is there among countries, often what we see in multilateral spaces is a divide where countries from the global north and the global south do not get well along together because of many underlying factors, whether those are socioeconomic factors, whether those are mostly financial factors, but then also cultural factors, because when you do global negotiations, they cannot be, on terms of one particular culture or a type of culture. This argument can go down into whole argument of moral plurality, and how do you see the world together. But coming down to the fact that we still very much in international spaces operate in a framework where people that have caused problems, polluters that have caused historical problems, are the one convening these spaces, including providing funding to these spaces to solve the problems. And people that are actually being affected by these problems in international spaces, countries, communities, frontline communities, they are mostly just being in a way just engaging in in those discussions and trying to even carve their space out, when they in fact should be the ones in the front lines when it comes to the UN, or especially the multilateral processes. And this is something that we are trying to do through the major group of youth and children, to bring more diverse engagement in some of these things. And hopefully that provides some context to you for the beginning, and we continue the discussion here. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Yugratna. I think just several things to note specifically for those of us who aren't necessarily aware. There's a lot of youth engagement, but I think still a lot of barriers existing within the global climate change movement, but in itself. But I think also some good analysis there specifically on a lot of maybe the conflicts or issues that generally go within the framework and within the establishment of the policy in itself, right? Coming in from different backgrounds. I think given that Yugratna is from India, she also similarly has a global south context, even though slightly different from not necessarily being African, right? But I think we can see some cross-cutting issues when it comes to the global south context generally to do with climate change. So I think finally, Eli, just a question specifically on maybe to build on an issue that has sort of been touched on. So SDGs in themselves, and let's say like sustainable development education, a lot of these concepts in themselves sound very fancy, but not necessarily many people know what they're actually about. So how do you deal with development agendas, mainly unknown to a lot of people and citizens? Specifically, what's the role of universities, and what's the role of just getting a lot of this information out there for people to be more aware?
Absolutely. So, as a person who has a background in kind of film, TV, radio, part of what I was taught very early on is that if you cannot explain it to a third grader, you don't know it well enough. And I think that we haven't held that standard, right? We've let science, we've let industry kind of take the lead in how we discuss and how we actually implement and develop policy. So what needs to happen is, if it's actually good policy, then it should be something that everyone can understand and everyone can support. And that effort has to be made to take policy from its top levels of super intricate, super scientific conversation, and then drilling it down, right? Most of what we talk about in environmental issues and climate change issues are very simple. We need the planet doesn't need us. We are negatively impacting the planet and is also negatively impacting us. It is very simple, right? We can definitely get more complex, but recognizing that there's so much capacity for us to drill down to the core things: how you treat yourself, how you treat the planet, the way that we need to sustain ourselves as a culture and community. That's where the base is. That's always been the base for people of color, right? We've lived based on culture. That's our central point, the central point of identity. And so it's about making sure that the changes that we want, environmental changes, social justice changes, equity changes, are ones that we want make accessible to everyone so that everyone understands it, is on the same page and working toward the same goal. but two, it is kind of being implemented in a way where people are basically ingrained in it. It is a cultural pipeline that you learn as a child. This is the way to live. The same that we are all raised. There are certain things that become cultural norms, and we have to get to that. The way we get to that is by empowering people, one, at the bottom, and two, people who kind of fill out that structure. So when you think about how does a child develop, how do they learn? They learn from the family, they learn from church or religious influence, they learn from school, right? So if you don't train teachers on how to be sustainable, you're missing an opportunity to train the next generation. So recognizing that the infrastructure pieces we have when it comes to higher education and how we train and teach students, no matter what field of interest they are in, right? It shouldn't be acceptable to go to school for business but not understand core concepts of climate change and sustainability. Why? Because we need everyone to get it. So we have to get on board with the belief that this is an entire team effort. And the team is literally the global majority of people on this planet. That global majority is people of color, that is African people, no matter where we are on the planet. And so aligning in that way and aligning ourselves culturally in that way, which I think exists a lot already in our communities, is the key. And then taking that cultural element and allowing it to basically be amplified by the skills, by the development that business, that entrepreneurship, that green enterprise, that education provide for them.
Thank you for that. I think what's most important specifically about a lot of what you've mentioned, right, is the fact that it's not necessarily just doing this at a later level, right? This is something that can begin at a much earlier stage and be integrated a lot with socialization. And I think this is specifically crucial because the problem of climate change is that it's a problem of future generations, and hence we're probably not experiencing the worst that climate change has to offer, and future generations are bound to experience the most severe impacts of climate change, right? So it's about how sustainable are our lives now, but also how sustainable are our lives for future generations. Thank you for that, Eli. Sorry, thank you. Yeah, sorry. Thank you for that, Eli. So I think from there now we can maybe just go into maybe a brief question, and this might be a bit of a technical question, but I think Dr. Ekoto will be able to break this down. So within international environmental law policy, right, there's the principle that exists of common but differentiated responsibilities. This principle generally establishes that all states are responsible for addressing global environmental destruction, not equally responsible. There's been a lot of criticisms, I think, from third world scholars arguing that in itself this principle exists, but in a lot of the implementation of the legal frameworks that exist, I mean, in the implementation of a lot of climate change frameworks, we don't necessarily see the idealization of this principle. Especially given the fact that climate change does intersect with a lot of systemic issues. Dr. Ekoto, what do you think about this? And maybe what do you think the relationship is between the principle and how third world countries relate with this principle?
Thank you very much. The system is my own stream. In terms of the principle, which is is quite an interesting concept because when we're trying to say that different countries should have different responsibilities, there should be differential, different common but differentiated responsibility. But the question is this not going to lead to what's called distributive injustice, for example? Should the differential treatment of countries, how should we treat that international climate change? For example, should countries be liable for the same amount of economic payment or the same amount of money in relation to climate change? Or if you flip that as well, what of developing countries? I know Brazil and a couple of other countries are dependent on countries like Germany in terms of payment for related to climate change. So the question is, does this principle actually promote justice or not? That is the question. So a lot of people have said it does not actually promote justice. That is not. So that's one way to look at the common but differentiated principle. I don't know if that answers your question. because my system is breaking here. So
Sorry, yes, I think you do answer. I think additionally, Eli would also like to further elaborate on this.
Absolutely. So one of the best illustrations of this for me is looking at on the continent as nations are starting to develop and become international players and international powerhouses. They're seeing a lot of pushback from the West as they're looking to potentially develop their natural resources, whether that's gas, that's oil, that's existing on the continent. What we do know is historically, Europe has built itself off of those same resources and enslaving Africans. So now here we are, eons, decades later, and Europe wants to say, no, Africa can't develop oil because we're in a climate crisis, which is true. But we are in a climate crisis because of choices that were largely made by the West and that largely continue to be made by the West. And so the argument for Africa and the diaspora is we have every right to develop ourselves and use whatever resources that God has given us on our continents, on our land to do so. So it's unreasonable to expect countries like Nigeria, like Ghana, to not develop themselves and advance using whatever resources they have, while also recognizing that if we do go full blown advancing oil, advancing resources that we know don't they have a finite limit to them, you're building essentially a platform that can't live forever. It's not sustainable. So the clash is that essentially both sides are right, which makes it a bigger conundrum. Because yes, Africa has every right to develop itself and not be limited by arbitrary numbers that are set by the West, who largely pollute it. But at the same time, we know that Africa can't survive if it develops using the existing models of development, which are largely based in fossil fuels. So what that means is the West, we kind of have to do both. The West has to contribute. So if the West wants Africa, wants the continent, wants people of color to not develop themselves using their existing resources, they have to supply something that supplements that, which means if you want Africa to develop solar first, invest in, right? Give back all of that you stole from the continent back in the form of climate positive methods of developing the infrastructure that these countries deserve and need. So I think the core message in terms of when we're looking at going into COP, going into UN negotiations is we absolutely agree that using the pre-existing methods don't work, but we need to move forward in a way that is equitable and fair. And if you want us to not use our resources, you have to give us an incentive, not a whack of a stick after you've already beaten us for decades.
Well, I think yeah, that's extremely powerful. Yes, just also noting, I think again a lot of the systemic issues that have to do with climate change, right? The fact that this begins even towards the pre-colonial history and a lot of the injustice that generally was within that point, and I think we generally manifest in a lot of the neo-colonial practices that still continue to plague the continent. So thank you, Dr. Ekotor and Eli, for that response. So I think you Gratna, maybe just question specifically on how do you think or why do you think this is specifically, and maybe this is just in context of why is this specifically a youth issue in this case? And I think you had briefly talked about how the youth aren't necessarily as included, but I think your CV also extensively speaks to a lot of youth inclusion in a lot of like climate change policy and spaces. So what has been the impact of this, and why do you think this is something that's important in the long run?
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I think, first of all, why youth have to be included. I think it's a rights-based argument. First of all, the argument really is that when young people today at the moment comprise over 40% of the world's population, in fact, Africa is one of the youngest continents that we have where the average age is much lower than the other continents, and therefore making it, one of the continents where young people actually are there. And if you have followed some of the trends that we are seeing in the reports from the UN, it's been discussed that several, over 30%, 40% of young people that are living in certain countries actually want to consider running for office. So it's a rights-based argument in the sense that those that will be most impacted by the problems that we are facing today have to be included in those processes and have to be fully informed. We talked about SDGs earlier. So this year, next year actually, UN is having a midterm review of SDGs, the 2030 agenda. And while the reality stands that many people don't even know what SDGs are, it still continues to be something that's known within a particular bubble, within a particular type of groups. And essentially, UN has, created many more processes. Even within the UN, there are people that kind of do not fully grasp what 2030 agenda or the coherence within the 2030 agenda means. And it is extremely important that when the midterm review next year of the 2030 agenda happens during UNGA in September, that young people are engaged not just at the process itself, but in the preparatory process from now until the next year. And this process is equally as important as the Stockholm Plus 50 process was. So that is one of the things that we may want to point out. The other thing, if you want to look at youth engagement, is that there are discussions going on in the UN at the moment, and a negotiation / a resolution on establishment of a dedicated office for youth, which is essentially called as the UN Youth Office, and discussions are going on. And me and some more colleagues from our side have been strong advocates that this UN Youth Office should actually be based somewhere where young people do not need visas or have easy access to visa to travel. Putting up another office in New York is just perpetuating the problems that we have when it comes to access to the United Nations. So there has been a advocacy that this office should be based either in Nairobi or in Addis Ababa. So actually, the Global South can host this, and young people are able to access that, rather than putting up another building in New York and saying that now this is where the young people have to be engaged and access and have their advocacy centered. So these are some of the points that we have to look at in context of a broader picture. But then also, maybe I'll mention another point, that we often see disconnect within the grassroots space, although grassroots actually have been recognized as one of the several stakeholder groups when you look at some of the UN processes. But still, what we see is that there is a particular segment of youth that continue to be engaged in these processes, which mean young people that have gone to universities, that have access to education, that have laptops. Having a laptop, note taking on a Google Doc is also a privilege. Many young people do not even have computers to actually engage in certain processes. So recognizing that and making sure that the space continues to exist for young people from grassroots community and minority communities is very, very essential. So when we are advocating at the UN, it's not to advocate for them, but it's to advocate in a way so the spaces are opened up and where they can directly come and engage, and they do not have to go through specific people or movements or organizations and networks to join or have their voices heard. People have right to direct representation in such processes. Thank you.
Thank you for that response. I think very elaborate and clear about a lot of the existing mechanisms. And I think even just looking at the intersectionality between issues, right? So it's not necessarily just accessibility for youth, but it's also accessibility for youth specifically in the global south, as I think we can all agree they're further marginalized in terms of access to a lot of the discourse and the policy. So I think before we go into the Q&A, just one specific question, I think, and maybe this goes out to any member of the panel who feels that this is something that they can be able to address. Sorry. Yeah, so maybe they can be able to address. So I think this is specifically towards the solutions that we're having towards climate change. And this is, what exactly do you think are market solutions in the status quo towards climate change, and how can they be driven towards the third world context? So market solutions towards climate change, and are these specifically third world market solutions? Or global south market solutions, yes. So I think any member of the panel can
I'm down to
take this
take it on.
question.
Okay. So for me, when it comes to the global south, which I include Black America as part of that, because obviously, like, we're in the West, but we have a very, very unique experience in the West, and there are a lot of us. So there are about 41 million Black people in the U.S., which, as compared to like the population of Ghana, which has 31 million, we're effectively a country, right? And so when I think about the development of kind of sustainable lifestyles for Black people in the global South, what I think about is kind of transforming and doing so at an aggressive speed, which means that we are going to have to skip some things. So traditional business forms that don't work, we're going to skip, right? So that means that, to me, the global south needs to invest in technology and in specifically energy that is renewable, because those are going to be the two core pieces that make the infrastructure around society run, right? You're going to need power, you're going to need the basic needs, water. You have to find a way to meet that infrastructure, but we need to do that in a sustainable way, build it right the first time. So that means that when we're looking at on the continent, we're expanding people's access to internet, expanding people's access to transportation, doing it in a clean and green way, and doing it right the first time. We have the opportunity to do that because we don't have a whole lot of existing infrastructure that we would need to reform like the West does, right? We don't have a whole tons of built infrastructure in those ways. So we can take advantage of that. That's an area of opportunity. And so recognizing that we are unique and that we don't necessarily have the same access to resources, but we do have ourselves, and that is a huge amount. So building based on entrepreneurship, building based on sustainability, and building things that we know can actually last and develop us and for the future, for 40 years, for 60 years, that's going to be how we obtain the advantage. Is someone is going to produce the things that the world is going to need moving forward. The same way, if you were in position to make masks before COVID hit, you became someone who was making a ton of money unexpectedly. So we have to invest in those things that we know the future is going to need, right? So that's green transportation, that's technology advancement. Those are the things that we know the future is going to need. So our countries and our communities have to invest in being able to develop that, to understand that, to create training programs that lead people into that. So whether that's solar installation, wind installation, we have to invest in that infrastructure now to allow for when that opportunity opens up, we're available to take advantage of it.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Eli. I think any other member of the panel? Okay, so I think maybe just one final question before we go into the Q&A session. So, Dr. Ekator, specifically, I mean, and I think this question is specifically to you, but I think also any other member of the panel can contribute and add in. So, when it comes to the conflict, and I think specifically for global South states, which is as to whether to meet their climate change obligations or as to meet their developmental agendas. I think we've seen this conflict very present, specifically within a lot of the fast or industrializing countries, right? I think countries like Brazil, and even to a large extent, countries that are not necessarily newly industrialized, but countries such as, for example, Nigeria, who have a lot of infrastructural projects coming up. How do these states then balance the climate change obligations that they still have while still meeting a lot of their developmental goals?
I can try tripping on that, Marimu. Just,
Sorry. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. I can also go up after you.
I was on mute. Sorry.
Please go ahead, yeah.
Okay, thank you for the questions. Apologies, my system was on mute. I think in terms of the question, I think when we talk about development, sustainability, and climate change, sustainable development, sustainability can go with economic development. The problem is that a lot of developing countries, a lot of countries in the global south, they prioritize economic development to the detriment of the environment. So if you're going to say you're going to get some money and develop infrastructure, you need to think of the existing laws and regulations on the environment. You need to protect the environment. It is doable and it's possible. There's no person, I think there's a perfect synergy between environmental protection and development. In my view, there's no disconnect. They can actually work together. And if you look at, for example, if you think about the African Charter and Human People's Rights, for example, the various provisions of the African Charter that promote sustainable development, sometimes developing countries use the excuse of economic development to damage the environment. So if you damage the environment in the guise of development, for example, you are still going to pay for that damage. You are still going to pay, you are still going to restore the environment, and society is still going to be worse off at the end of the day. So if we take this analogy closer to the example of the Niger Delta, for example, and socioeconomic rights and climate change, where ordinarily the activities of multinational corporations impact negatively on the rights of the people living in Niger Delta. For example, oil spillage, gas flare impact on access to food, right to health, right to housing, etc. Now, if you look at in terms of the impact of climate change, for example, in terms of rainfall, extreme weather in Nigeria, it has also impacted negatively on access to food, for example. Now, these activities of MNCs in conjunction with the negative impacts of climate change are now affecting the already vulnerable people in Nigeria. They are now worse off. Now, the question is, if the Nigerian government, Nigerian society has actually prioritized environmental protection, environmental justice from day one, then they'll be able to tackle these negative impacts of climate change on the rights of people who are already vulnerable now. So now the people who are already vulnerable to alleged human rights violations by MNCs still bear the brunt of the negative impact of climate change on them, impacting on their human rights. So now the question is, the government, the MNCs need to resolve this problem. So because the Nigerian government have prioritized economic development over sustainable development from day one, over environmental justice from day one, now the people are bearing the brunt of the negative impact of climate change. So to me, that's why I said the best thing for government is to always, as much as possible, be aware of the potential damage of infrastructural development, of economic development on the environment and society, and as much as possible, try to mitigate it. It doesn't mean that you're not going to damage the environment. As much as possible, try to mitigate it and reduce the negative externalities on the environment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doctor. I think that was very profound. And I think we sort of have a sort of call to action there specifically for a lot of government actors in terms of their prioritization of policy. Ugratna, you had some few words to chime in.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vairima, for the question. So, when we talk about environmental protection and peacekeeping and peace building and those topics, often, UN calls it what they term as emerging issues, but it is more than just, a thematic discussion. This literally is something that is affecting people's life in present. I mean, of course, climate changes and all the other environmental triple planetary crises are, but this is something where people are literally losing their lives when it comes to environmental peace building, whether that is in context of wars, whether that is in context of environmental defenders and those kind of things. And there are a couple of elements to consider in this. So first, being really that when we talk about environmental peace building, we have to discuss this not just as an issue that will come up in future, but as something that is affecting people right now, right? And secondly, an important way to do this would be to not see environmental problems and their solutions as silos, but as a one system where they work with each other. Often in certain mindsets we have things about dividing things, like where you have different SDGs, for instance, or different frameworks. But really the solution is when people come together and viewing problems as one, as everything affects everything in a way. And if you look at Stockholm Plus 50, for instance, it prioritized environmental peace building in some of its discussion, although I'm not sure how much it gets captured in the final outcomes sort of that I get to actually come out. There are also UN Security Council has been picking up discussions on climate security and these topics as well, although a lot still needs to be done in a way. But I think the baseline comes down to really acting as a one system and looking at problems in a coherent way. And then, to make a final point on, yeah, just to look at, our final point on this, which is look at the amount of funding that is being mobilized for this. If billions of dollars can be mobilized in a matter of days and weeks to fight wars and to destroy people and planet and do activities that destroy people and planet, why can't funding be mobilized for youth engagement? Why can't funding be mobilized for community-based solutions? It's not that money is not out there. It is. It is just a matter of political will and priorities and what suits more. And unfortunately, people do not see environmental crises in that way. And then very soon, they might. And it's important that youth from Africa actually take lead to implement this. And certain movements in the West have been advocating for rights of Black people and African Americans and other things, and that needs to continue. And at the same time, we need to make sure that this gets really mainstreamed, and with the climate change COP being in Africa, and also maybe the next one is also in the Middle East region in next year. It gives a lot of opportunity to the continent and even young people and the movements there, to mobilize and come up and build what is needed. Thank you.
I'd love to go last here. One, I want to second everything that's already been said, and additionally say that as a whole, our governments, our style, our ideology of how government looks and works needs to be redeveloped. We're resistant to changing and relying on old systems that were not, one, built for us, and two, don't work well for us. We've seen it in the way that our world currently looks. I believe fully and firmly that we have a government that, just in general, as a global kind of look at what governments mostly do, they allow people who won't actually suffer the consequences for decisions to make decisions, and that's something we can't continue to allow. That means we have to get younger overall in government. Our leadership, our training, our pipelines and programs have to get younger, because we're making a huge risk that we're leaving a generation without the necessary skills and the space to develop those skills and the empowerment to know when they're fully equipped and can make decisions. As we look at development, it doesn't have to be either sustainable or not. There's only one way to develop, and that is sustainable. Nothing else is an option. Take everything else off the table and empower the people who will suffer the most impacts first. Listen to their voices first, make space for them, make pipelines for them to be able to contribute, to grow, to educate themselves, to do their best and be their best selves. When you do that, I think you get the best input. You have the most knowledgeable voter base. You have the best possible outcomes situated together. And then when you power that with having young people actually empowered in office, making decisions, learning how to build a better world, and not having a bunch of people who kind of won't live to see the impacts of their decisions making them, I think we'll see a better outcome in the world overall.
Thank you for that, Eli. So just to maybe spotlight some of the audience that we're having. So I'm seeing here that we're having people tuning in from Delta in Nigeria. Welcome Ifi. We also have people tuning in from Zanzibar in Tanzania, Mafunda. We have Ivan who is tuning in from Arusha. And we also have some people tuning in from Busia, Kenya, and all over the region. I think Nisi is also tuning in from Zambia. So we have a question in the chat, and the question is from Edoru Stephen Martin, tuning in from Kampala, Uganda. So the question is, at COP26, one of the key outcomes was the completion of the Paris Rulebook. In effect, the operationalization of the Paris Agreement. What's the commitment from parties to the conference so far? Maybe anyone can take this question. Feel free. I think.
I mean, I would say on the U.S. side, obviously, we just passed a huge climate bill, so that's a pretty big step forward in terms of us living up to the commitments that we've made. Obviously, we saw a huge delay with our previous president, who basically said, "I'm not doing it," which was an interesting take for a government leader to have. But now that we have a little bit more sane government, we're seeing investments in, one, getting cleaner, two, getting greener faster. So when it comes to looking at the climate bill that we passed, and then also what infrastructure we're building. So internally looking at how state governments are starting to support green products, green industry, and then green living as a whole, I think is how the U.S. is trying to live up to its kind of Paris Agreement commitments. I don't necessarily know that it's as aggressive as it needs to be given how much we pollute, but it is definitely a huge first step. And we are kind of in a moment of crisis, in that we do have to do a lot of political engagement to retain those benefits. Because yes, it's passed, but until the money's actually spent and it's done, it's still at risk. So I would say overall, with the current government, it looks like the U.S. is on track to kind of keep those commitments, with our legislature having passed the Climate Change Act.
Thanks for this, Eli. I think Ugratna has some views on this.
Yes, thank you very much for that question, Mamiru. Just I think a couple of points on this. So, if sorry, let me just turn on your camera. Yeah. So COP26, of course, concluded a lot of things on the Paris Agreement work program, or rule book, as it is called. If you look at concrete commitment from certain parties, some countries have revised their NDCs, which specifically refer to the nationally determined contributions, in the sense that these are the commitments that countries have when it comes to specific their actions within the convention. So that has happened, although it could be much more. There was a report from the UN just, I think, before COP26 actually happened last year at some point of time, which talked about that commitments are still not enough, though, even if you have revised or updated your national plans, and we are not on the trajectory for 1.5 degrees decrease by 2030, which is required as per science and IPCC. That is one part. The other part is that COP26 actually fixed and operationalized. The rule book was the climate markets, the carbon markets, where you have a trading scheme of offsets, and then how the whole carbon marketing can happen as per international standards that have been implemented, and those are the things that are now moving forward. At the same time, the human rights consideration on those aspects remain very low. The human rights safeguards, the rights of indigenous peoples and other things in that particular process, has still continues to find a space. There is, no space for them that is there. So those are, some of the things that still continue to be a challenge. And if you look at that, there have been some progress, arguably, on the youth side, where you have the new work program on ACE, which is Action for Climate Empowerment, Article 12 of the Paris Agreement, which is related to education and public participation, and also a lot of youth engagement gets centered there. So that, is moving forward in a reasonably good direction. But a lot needs to happen. You can't just see COP as yet another climate carnival. It really has to deliver not just climate COP, but actually all the COPs across biodiversity, chemicals, desertification, and everything. All the negotiations that you have where countries are coming together, not trying to pose a doomsday scenario, but we really are not on the right track on any of the environmental crises. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ugratna. And I think as we come to the end, just to maybe spotlight some people who are listening in, I think from Aobasi from Moyo, Uganda, we have Dinah from Nairobi, Kenya. Welcome. We're just concluding. We're just concluding. So I'll ask, I think, each member of the panel maybe to just give us a parting shot, which might include maybe a call of action to the audience, and tell us just anything in terms of any sort of output or any sort of message that you'd like to give the audience. Yeah, so we'll begin with Eli.
All right. So as you can kind of see behind me, the HBCU Green Fund is the name of my nonprofit, which is HBCU Green, like the color, Fund, FUND. Our handle on Instagram is at HBCU Green Fund. We are hosting a virtual summit September 19th through 23rd for Africa and the diaspora to talk about sustainable development, to talk about the goals, and to connect before we even get to COP. So that way we're not meeting there. We're aligned before we even get there. You can follow us on Instagram for more details. Registration and live streaming will be there. And feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Eli. I think thanks for also giving us more platforms in which we can be able to connect and generally discuss these issues deeper. We'll now move to Dr. Ekoto.
Okay.
Sorry, you're not yet audible.
Okay. Is this am I the next now?
Yes, yes.
In
So it's
terms of
over
my
to you.
thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity for me to be part of this for this important event. And also, I think, firstly, the youths, the younger people, have a very very important role of playing in terms of trying to, in a way, trying to mitigate negative impact of climate change. Because at the end of the day, the youth, the younger people are the ones who are going to bear the brunt of the negative impact. So there should be a more sort of like, if you look at it in terms of climate justice, the role of the younger generation, the role of the youth in institutional cases is something which has been going on in other parts of the world. I think the youths in Africa should go beyond protests or demonstrations, should try to see how they can impact on policy by litigation, advocacy, etc. I think there's a lot of work to be done from an African perspective, and also from the government perspective. Some governments in Africa actually domesticate. They've actually enacted climate change laws. A good example is Nigeria and Kenya. So relevant stakeholders should use the instrumentality to actually improve the education of the global climate change sort of framework. Because from look at it from an outsider, it looks like a top-down uh, legal framework. So the ordinary people, the ordinary person in the village, in the town, in the city, in Africa, in the global south should feel a connection with the international climate change regime. So there has to be more work done by African government, by governments in the global south, for the ordinary person to understand the negative impact of climate change and how everybody can actually contribute to trying to make the world a better place. So finally, we look at a perspective of energy transitions, for example, that we should decarbonization and move to a low carbon economy. We tell someone who lives in a very poor African community that has no access to energy sources, that has no access to electricity, that has no access to energy for his cooking, etc. How can such a person buy into energy transition, buy into decarbonization? So there's a lot of work to be done for the ordinary person to act in, from a developing country perspective, to actually see themselves as an important stakeholder in this fight against the scourge of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ekoto. Finally, we have you, Gratna. Your parting words.
Yeah, no, I would like to say that, first of all, I'm very delighted to be here, and I want to congratulate the East African Youth Platform for the great work that you have been doing. It's not easy, and especially being a bottom-up youth movement, a youth-led movement. Please, sorry, I think it's working. Yeah. Please continue doing that work. It is at the center of it. It may not. Many a times, young people and youth movements from the global south, they don't have fancy, websites or Twitter accounts and Facebook pages and those kind of things. And that is not a reason to be thinking that we're not doing enough, because we cannot. As I was talking earlier, when it comes to youth movement, when it comes to youth engagement, the parameters or context specific. So you cannot be just judged by parameters of another region or continent or another socioeconomic group. You have to, be judged your own parameters in terms of what you're doing. So that is one thing I would like to point out, to please keep doing this and please keep engaging young people. Second point I want to mention is that East Africa is a place where a lot of UN agencies, a lot of critical organizations including UNEP, UN Habitat and many others are hosted. So it's very crucial that we continue to build the grassroots and bottom up community there that you all have initiated in a way. So that is second thing that I want. And the final, of course, on more of a youth note, I just want to mention that when we talk about youth engagement, we have often been going ahead with the narrative where we say if it's not meaningful, if it's not youth engagement. And that's the one thing I would like to mention. It's a time where we need to uh, come together, not just as a youth community, but also as youth, not in just sense of that, oh, we are youth wanting to engage, but also as young people that have solutions, that have their work included. And final point I would like to mention is a message of universality, which means that when we are moving ahead in these policy discourses, we cannot leave anyone behind, and we really have to operate in a way that includes all young people. So please continue what you are doing. The UN and other spaces where decisions are made, they are beginning to look at young people even more and more. What the attention that essentially gender had maybe 10 years ago, youth are having it now, and hopefully such discussions and dialogues continue. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ugratna, and specifically also just to pass on the message to the rest of the East African community youth ambassadors. So I think at this point, maybe we can do a brief vote of thanks, and first like to thank all the panelists for their amazing contributions today. I think we've all learned a lot, specifically from the amount of detail, and I think even the amount of explanations that they've gone into, I think breaking down a lot of technical concepts, but also giving us a lot of analysis into a lot of the global issues that we generally face with climate change. So I'd like to thank Dr. Ekoto, and I think we've also noticed that they come from different fields in terms of practice, with Dr. Ekoto being in academic research and teaching, amazing contributions there, with Ugratna being in policy and advocacy, and giving us, I think, a lot of the perspective coming in from that, from the policy side. And I think even Eli giving us from the aspect of having of not necessarily only coming from the US in this case, but also having a lot of activist and a lot of activist and like advocacy perspective specifically coming into this issue. So thank you all. And also just thank you, Lead Africa, for this platform, and finally the East African Community Youth Ambassadors platform, from which I am a member, for curating the subject and even developing a lot of the questions that were specifically involved today. Thank you all, I think also to the guests who've been amazing, and I think just the contributions in terms of the questions. We thank you all for joining us. Have a good evening.
Bye, thank you.